Welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. Laura Cohen, and I'm the Executive Director of the Harriet and Kenneth Kupferberg Holocaust Center at Queensborough Community College at the City University of New York. Our mission is to use the lessons of the Holocaust to educate current and future generations about the ramifications of prejudice, racism, and stereotyping. Today's event is entitled Intersecting Identities, Navigating Race and Religion, and it's a conversation about the intersection of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. It's also co-sponsored by the Nancy and David Wolf Holocaust and Humanities Center and the Center for the Study of Genocide and Human Rights at Rutgers University. Please be sure to submit your questions about today's event via the Q&A button on your screen, as we've disabled the chat for security reasons. This program is actually very exciting for me. It's inspired by conversations I've had with both of our speakers, who are also esteemed colleagues. Dr. Mark Dollinger, he's professor and Richard Rhoda Goldman Chair in the Department of Jewish Studies at San Francisco State University, and Dr. Manaz Afridi, Professor of Religious Studies and Director of the Holocaust, Genocide, and Interfaith Education Center at Manhattan College. Earlier this year in the spring, or maybe it was sometime during the pandemic, I was intrigued by a public lecture series that Dr. Dollinger gave, which was focusing on the nuances of the Jewish community's support of the civil rights movement in the 1960s. And it included a fascinating, albeit sometimes controversial, discussion about the intersection of Judaism, whiteness, and the political environments of the North and the South at that time. I've had similar conversations about identity, religion, and xenophobia with Dr. Afridi from the moment we met at the University of Nebraska in Omaha. It was a conference convened by the Consortium of Higher Education Centers for Holocaust, Genocide, and Human Rights Studies, of which she's a founding executive committee member. We've collaborated on many events since then, and she is both a mentor and a close friend who continually encourages me to be brave during these intensely political and fraught times. And so the way today's conversation will be structured is I'll first introduce formally Dr. Dollinger. He'll talk a little bit about his research. We'll do the same with Dr. Afridi, and then we'll have a conversation. And again, please remember to, and if you're inspired to, submit some questions. So first, allow me to please introduce Dr. Mark Dollinger. Again, holds the Richard and Rhoda Goldman Chair in the Jewish Studies and Social Responsibility Department at San Francisco State University. He's the author of Black Power, Jewish Politics, Reinventing the Alliance in the 1960s, as well as Quest for Inclusion, Jews and Liberalism in Modern America. He's also the co-editor of California Jews and American Jewish History, a primary source reader. And Dr. Dollinger obtained his PhD in history from UCLA. Dr. Dollinger, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. Honored to be here with you, Dr. Cohen, Dr. Afridi as well. My academic field is religion and politics. The two topics you're not supposed to talk about in polite conversation. I'm working now on a book on campus anti-Semitism. It's sort of half memoir and half scholarly. And that's because I started my academic career teaching at a community college campus in a right-wing political organization. And there, when anti-Semitism, erupted on campus, I was labeled the self-hating leftist Jew. And the climate on campus became so fraught for me that I actually needed to resign my tenure. And I found this new position where I am now at San Francisco State University, which is quite leftist. So I thought I was, well primed to be at a leftist school, having had this experience at a right-wing school. And I showed up for my first day of work, and I became a right-wing Zionist colonial imperialist. Magically, all with a 400-mile drive from Southern California to Northern California. So my book is going to kind of unwind that day and how that can work. Well, I do have a few titles. One of my friends said I should just call the book Stuck in the Middle with Jew. As Dr. Cohen said, I'm interested in Jews, whiteness, power, and privilege. And mostly what I do in my academic work is I challenge how white American Jews remember or misremember our social justice history. In my first book, Quest for Inclusion, I looked at liberalism, American Jewish liberalism from the 1930s to the 70s. And especially around the civil rights movement, discovered that the three most important reasons to explain Jewish participation, that Blacks and Jews have a common history, a common sociology, and that Judaism itself demands social justice, actually wasn't borne out by the historical evidence. So I try to rework that. In a collection of historical documents in American Jewish history, at least the ones focused on the work of around race and racism, I talk about how new definitions and understanding racism, at least among white Jews, shows that for centuries, at some points, Jews have been engaged in actual racism, like the worst kinds that we could describe. And even more so, there's been a lot of Jewish complicity in racism. And certainly, at least since World War II, especially benefiting from racism in American Jewish history. And then my most recent book takes a new look at the Black Power movement. And rather than seeing it as an anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic, particularist, identity-based movement that was bad for the Jews, to use that phrase, I actually found that Jewish leaders kind of loved Black Power because it gave them the script they needed to create Jewish identity projects. And I argue that the Soviet Jewry movement owes a whole lot to Black Power, that American Zionism, especially after the 1967 Six-Day War, borrowed so much from Black Power, Jewish religious ethnic revival as well. And even the Jewish political turn to the right, the neoconservative Jews, even though they, of course, disagreed on content with Black Power activists, were actually, I think, molding themselves a lot in that space. So I land in a place in my scholarship and also in sort of public teaching of both and I think we'll get into it in our conversation tonight, that, and I'm speaking now of white Jews in particular, face persecution from anti-Semitism, certainly throughout Jewish history and even in 21st century contemporary America. So on one hand, Jews suffer victimization. On the other hand, Jews also benefit from the privilege of the racial hierarchy. So what does it mean to be both victim and, if we can say it, victimizer at the same time? As an academic, I'm in the Department of Jewish Studies. I love it. I mean, loving it from an academic point of view, the topic is quite fraught. But I think looking through a Jewish lens at these concepts, when you have a group of people that has experienced all of it, sometimes simultaneously, can give us a really good lens through which to view. And I'm really excited for the topic we have tonight and for the chance to learn and grow with you.
Thank you so much. And, that's part of why I wanted to have this conversation, is thinking beyond the traditional narratives of the way we think about history and the way we're thinking about our contemporary society. But before we get into the conversation, I want now to turn it over to Dr. Manaz Afridi. She's professor of religious studies and director of the Holocaust, Genocide, and Interfaith Education Center at Manhattan College, where she teaches courses on Islam, the Holocaust, genocide, comparative religion, and feminism. Her recent book, Shoah Through Muslim Eyes, was nominated for the Yad Vashem International Book Prize for Holocaust Research and the Jacob Schnitzer Book Award. She's currently working on her next book, The Wounded Muslim, and the co-edited volume, International Approaches to the Holocaust. In 2019, she was awarded the Costello Award for Teaching Excellence in the School of Liberal Arts at Manhattan College, and she obtained her PhD from the University of South Africa and her master's and bachelor's from Syracuse University. Dr. Afridi, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Laura and Mark as well. I mean, I was just listening to Mark going, okay, don't stop, let's keep going. I totally want to be your audience in this. So, I mean, my research is kind of weird, and it's kind of an anomaly because I started with a lot of critical theory and philosophy, and I did a lot of history of religion. I'm really a religious studies person. And then I did a lot of work during my master's and also PhD on 19th, 20th century Germany, specifically on anti-Semitism and German philosophy. So I come from this very strange, but I think a very unique interdisciplinary background. And then my PhD is actually in Islamic literature. I wrote my dissertation on Naguib Mahfouz, who is the Egyptian Nobel laureate, one of the first Arabs in the world to get the Nobel Prize. And then I had sort of a journey where I became interested in Judaism and the Holocaust in terms of research, but also in terms of how perhaps Muslims and Arabs were connected to it. So that's why I teach both the Holocaust requirements at Manhattan College, but also the Islam in terms of Manhattan College. So I am sitting on the intersections of Islamophobia, being a Muslim woman myself, personally experiencing Islamophobia, teaching about it, deconstructing this notion of what is Islam in classes all the time, every semester, and also talking about the racialization of Muslims, right? I mean, that's very, very important to think about Arabs and Asians and Africans and how sort of we also Muslims have a hierarchy of racial denominations throughout. And then in terms of the Holocaust and looking at anti-Semitism, I'm looking at not just anti-Semitism in terms of European anti-Semitism, but I'm also looking at Muslim and Arab anti-Semitism. I'm looking at laws that were set down in North Africa against both Jews and Arabs. What actually happened there? How were both Jews and Arabs racialized? I do a lot of work on Orientalism and post-colonialism. And I think what I'm really interested in and that I've written about in my book is the experience of being colonized and the experience of having the colonial powers inflict murder upon you. And how do we talk about that in one historical moment? So my new work now is called The Wounded Muslim, and it's about trauma and how we remember as Muslims what genocide is. It's interesting, but in the field of genocide, there hasn't been any work done on what do Muslims do in terms of trauma? How do they heal? What does Islam offer? What are the vehicles? How do we think about this? Do victims come out more faithful? Do they come out as atheists? I mean, a lot of these questions are also informed by post-Holocaust theology, which I teach and also have studied. But I think The Wounded Muslim is an important project because we always think of Muslim as the aggressor and never as the one who is wounded. Right now, and I'm doing interviews with victims of the Uyghur genocide, victims of the Rohingya, and also looking at Bosnia and doing interviews in Bosnia and Sarajevo, which I did this last summer. So these are really important narratives that I think that people are forgetting about because Muslims are supposed to be just warring and not being victims. So I'm trying to change that sort of story and sort of bringing that to the surface. And the other thing that I'm doing with my co-edited book with a very good friend, Mark Selesnik, is expanding the field of the Holocaust, right? So the international approaches to the Holocaust actually don't include Europe at all. This book is talking about what happened to Jews, what is the state of Holocaust education, what is anti-Semitism like in places like China, Japan, Palestine, Iran, Australia, South America. So we are really, I'm really fascinated by this because I think that one of the things I hear my colleagues, both Jewish and Christian in this field, talk about is how are we going to make this relevant? Well, we have to push it. We have to push the envelope and open it up. Of course, a lot of my work also is informed by Charles H. Long, who was a historian of religion, who taught me what racism was, African-American historian. And so I did a lot of work with him on W.E.B. Du Bois and got into Langston Hughes and James Baldwin. And being a Muslim myself, teach in my Muslims in America class, the first African slave Muslims that came to this country and what happened there, right? I mean, that's a big story that people are even looking at art and Ottoman art in terms of looking at the African being the slave and the Ottomans being on top, even though Islam talks about egalitarianism and social justice. So those are some of the things. And of course, being a woman, gender really plays a big role in my work, especially in terms of genocide. And we don't like to talk about it much. Also plays a big role in me doing interfaith work as a Muslim woman, a woman who does a lot of work on the Holocaust, becomes an anomaly for people. So there has been a lot of controversy when I got the position both from the Jewish and some from the Muslim community, about the kind of validity of my identity, not my scholarship, but my identity, being allowed to do this kind of work and what that means. So I have gone through periods of isolation. And actually, I think that it's probably something women should think about, and younger women should think about, in terms of, what is in our future with all this conversation about race and gender and identity and anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. And I think that if we really focus on being particularized and taking the challenge and having the courage of speaking about something that you're not necessarily supposed to, then I think we can actually make some difference and transformations in our academic life, but more so with my students and the activism work that I have been pursuing for quite some time. So I'm going to stop there.
You just touched upon so many topics, and one of the first questions was going to be, how does your gender and religion affect, how you are perceived? And I want to just build on what you're talking about. It's something that I also faced when I took up this job running the Kupferberg Holocaust Center. The first woman in the position, definitely younger than my predecessors. And Mark, I want to also bring you into this conversation, because one of the things that came up when we were discussing after the series, we were talking about your book and the controversies around that. But also you mentioned how, as an older white Jewish male scholar, you're able to deliver messages and have the community hear them in a way that, for example, I could not have that conversation. And I wanted to open the floor up to you to reflect on that.
Oh, wow. Okay, thank you. So I shall start a few years ago, let's say 5 years ago. Members from the Jews of color community would invite me out because they knew my research, because they were doing a project, and they'd say, would you please be our keynote speaker, and they're very, very nice and polite. And, this is the time, especially as a white man, to be direct and say, it's my understanding that you want me to say what experienced and have believed, but you understand that if you deliver it, it's not going to carry the weight than if I do. Yes. So I said, of course I'll do this. And may the day come soon that you don't need the privilege of a white man for messages, to be received. It's going to be up to people from communities of color to determine the extent to which the racial reckoning in this country in the last, year and a half has brought that to a better place. I certainly hope that it has. You mentioned the controversy. Should I sort of jump into that? Okay. So my last book, Black Power, Jewish Politics, received tremendous support. And I'll just say Black Jewish women especially lifted the book as they read it and saw it. And the good news is that it sold out like 3 printings within a year. The bad news is they're very little printings, because academic books don't get big printings. But still, that's because no one buys them. So they wanted me to write a new preface. And they wanted the new preface to reflect on how the racial reckoning of America intersects with the themes I described in the book. And I wrote about 2,000 words, linking the contemporary scene to the themes of the book. While I didn't realize it at the time, it was pointed out to me by the editors at the press that I used the word white supremacy in the new preface. Specifically, I said that white Jews, especially since World War II, have benefited from a system of white supremacy. I think I've pretty much memorized what I said at that point. And I also spoke about Jews of color, because I was taken to task by Black Jews, because as one expressed to me, I wrote 200 pages on Blacks and Jews and not a single page on a Black Jew. And I did not look at racial privilege as a lens through which to understand history. And once I was told, reread each of your chapters, look at racial privilege, and when I did, that was right on. So in the new preface, I called myself out for having done that, which I think scholars need to do as we self-reflect, and especially for someone who's, a white male writing about race in order to do it. The press initially accepted the new preface because, they invited it and they liked it. An anonymous reviewer, the next day after it was accepted, expressed such upset with my use of the term white supremacy, and to say that Jews of color had been erased from the historiography, that they made the unilateral decision not to publish the new preface. And then ultimately, though I did not ask for it, returned the legal rights of the book back to me so that I could take it to another press in order to do it. So this hit the national Jewish media, it hit social media, it hit the Facebook and the rest of it. I think that I was on the right side of this, and happy with my stance. And I just want to honor Professor Samira Mehta at University of Colorado, a untenured Jewish woman of color. And she had written an article, it's not yet published, I hope it will be published soon, where she took me to task to say, when you're a white man and you go up against your press, you end up a hero and your book gets sold out and the rest of it. And for her, as an untenured faculty member and a vulnerable one, there's one more university press she can't send her manuscripts to get published. I just published an article in the current Journal of Academic Freedom, and I included some of Professor Mehta's points, which is to say at the very, and this is really, I guess, really what my work is in a large way. One can be victimized and one can enjoy privilege without trying on either side. And I think to be reflective and thoughtful about that both and is really important. That I can call out historical inaccuracies and I can actually benefit from it. And I'll just jump one other thing. And when I was Professor Afridi, you said something that really resonated well with me. After the murder of George Floyd, synagogues and JCCs were reaching out like crazy. Like they got the book title and they called. This is the 123rd Zoom class or panel I've done since the murder of George Floyd. So that's good, right? Because I think it's good because I'm trying to educate, right? The flip side is racism happens. It's the white guy that gets all the attention and the honorarium, and the rest of it. And Manaz, you talked about the validity of your identity being challenged, in the work that you do, and I just want to affirm that from my perspective, even as a white man, or say as a white man, I crossed some lines. I crossed lines of white racial privilege. I crossed lines of male racial privilege, and that's very troubling. Within the Jewish community, especially older white men in the Jewish community, for whom my historical scholarship is a threat to so much of what they're invested in. So that I'm playing that dynamic out in a different gendered and racial way, but it's there too.
Yeah, I want to spend too much time on this question, but I do want to point out that privilege changes in many ways. If you look at history and you look at who is in power and who is in power of the narrative, but at the same time, I think that, there is, and especially in genocide studies, when you look at the history, say, even of Bosnia and what happened in Sarajevo, and you look at back in the 1400s, who was in power and who was a victim, or even just World War II, right? Victim can become oppressed and oppressor can become victim. That is very clear. So I think that is a very uncomfortable position for people to hear, because, it kind of takes away from their victimization. But actually it empowers it, because what it does is that when you start to really say to yourself, yes, I victimized Tunisian Jews in 1943, and I take responsibility for that. It actually lets you understand what it means to be victim then. Just being victimized does not really do that. And you can see this in lots of historical records in terms of genocide, in terms of racism. You can look at this in terms of women and gender rights, is that, the victimization is not something that we are to say, oh, that didn't happen, or that didn't happen to my community, or Muslims didn't do that, or Jews didn't do that. And I think that's a lesson that is really hard. It's like nobody wants to talk about race, right? Nobody wants to talk about race. My class doesn't want to talk about race. We talk about it all the time. And I'll say to them, why don't you want to talk about race? And they'll just look at me, and so you start to, say, okay, how do I get them to talk about race? They'll talk about one thing, they'll talk about ethnicity, but they won't talk about race. And so why is that? And it's that this discomfort, just like you won't talk about the fact that you were a perpetrator in some ways. So, I think part of that work that I do, Mark, to be honest, is to sort of say, okay, look, we have to be informed and intelligent, but also be very honest with our history. There's a certain kind of trust that we have to give to our history in order to be who we are, even if we look a little damaged, right? And how do we repair that damage, right? So Brian Stevenson is somebody who is amazing, who says, look, we have to acknowledge and we have to sort of take our history in a real way where we have to deal with our history. Look at Germany, he says, right? They don't have monuments of Hitler, right? But they preserve Holocaust memorials. Look at Germany, he says. They don't shy away from Native American or African American slavery classes or the fear of critical race theory, if people know what that means. But they actually teach about the Holocaust, right? So, there's these dimensions and ways that I think that if we want to be in this country, going to Laura, in terms of your question, is to be, vulnerable, because vulnerability actually helps us get to a stronger place. And I think that that's something we're shy of doing because we have identity politics and we want to protect, being Muslim or Jew or white or, brown like me, or, all of these things become problematic. And I think this is the problem I have about intersectionality, because it diffuses the issues that we all have, whether it's Black Americans, whether it's Jewish Americans, whether it's Muslim Americans, whether it's women, whether it's trans, that diffuses the problem. We are scared of particularizing who we are because it's too much work, Mark. It's too much work. And that is where I want to work with students and work with audiences to get them to that place.
I absolutely can relate. You mentioned Bosnia, one of the frames we often talk about when we're looking at the last Bosnian War is the Olympics of victimhood. Everybody suffered. And it then distances people from the atrocities that happen. And there's this assumption that if you say a community suffered, that somehow you're, for example, bringing the lens of gender in the Bosnian War was used, rape was used as a crime of war. All women suffered, but there are politics in acknowledging women who were Serb who were raped, because in that war, genocide, especially in Srebrenica, was committed by the Bosnian Serb army. So those dynamics are really, really critical. And I also just want to point out, for many people in the United States, Islamophobia comes to a head around September 11th. And Islamophobia not only becomes rife, but there's one image of Muslim people that come up. And in the case of Bosnia, Muslim people, there's a new book out by our colleague Hikmet Karcic, who edited a volume on the Muslim resolutions of 1945, where different Muslim communities are speaking out against violence that's not only happening against them, but their neighbors, their Serb neighbors, their Muslim neighbors, their Roma and Sinti neighbors. And I wanted to, Mark, ask you a little bit about, yes, you've done all these lectures. And is there what is sort of the impact that's had on you of pushing beyond these entrenched narratives? In Holocaust education and in so many of the events that are going on, we stick with the same narrative. The same event is happening over and over again. And there's less of an understanding of what's actually happened historically.
Yeah, thank you. And just to play on one of Manas's comments too, and I get a little religious here, it gets redemptive in terms of truth telling. And much of what I'm doing is challenging historical memory, which is, I was raised in the 1970s, in the sort of generation right after the 60s. And we were sort of given a wonderfully beautiful history of white Jewish involvement in civil rights work. And then as I went to the archives and I began to take a more critical look at it and to understand things, the first thought was, this is really scary, because all the foundations that I was raised on were falling away, and that's anxiety producing to see it. And then as I've been sort of going through the teaching and my own learning, because you believe, like on the Zoom interactions, I'm getting a lot of feedback and learning as I go. It ends up with a lot more vision of truthfulness and of multiple experiences by different people, and with that, things align. For example, in American Jewish history, for a lot of the professional field, it's been about exceptionalism. That America has been a different and better place for Jews, and Jews are different and better than any other Americans. And just look at the history in order to see it. And then all of the books and the journalism and the synagogues and rabbis, educators are advancing this. And now in this moment, we're undermining the exceptionalist thesis and looking at ways in which, as Manaz argued, one could be victimizer and victim at the same time. And owning that is actually a way to relieve all of us of a tremendous weight, on our shoulders. And I hope, this is out of my field and now, in terms of going with it, but I'll just, hope that we can, get to a better place in terms of human relations, if we can all own our own humanity and the complexities around it.
Well, I was just thinking about, and I think, Mark, you're the expert here in terms of Black America and Jewish America and the relationship. But like I said, I was thinking about Langston Hughes today, and I just want to read you a quote. And I think it's a very unsettling quote, but it's a really important quote because it recognizes victimhood, but it also is recognizing privilege at the same time. And he writes, Suggestions to White Shopkeepers from 1943. He states, if you are Jewish or foreign born, and if your own people abroad have known the evils of Hitlerism, that would seem to me all the more reason why you should be interested in the problems of your colored customers in America, who have long known the evils of local fascist practices, although in the past we have not called Jim Crow by a fascist name. And it just struck me, this quote about exactly what we're talking about, there's different moments. And he talks about, his mother saying, oh, another 50 Jews were killed in Russia. And he's like, wow, that's not even as many that are being lynched here, right? I mean, it's this unbelievable sort of like, thinking about what's going on at the same moment to two different people. And I think that is sort of the real nuance that, I like to bring to even my Holocaust work is, colonization was huge for Muslims. Colonization, under colonization, Arabs and Muslims were completely, taken apart as human beings, their culture, their language, their autonomy, their agency, their religion. There were missionaries set everywhere. It was like, we have to change these uncivilized people. And, and there was a complete sort of like, I think lack or loss of identity because of this. And I'm wondering, like, when my work, I talk about the colonial period in terms of Arabs and also Palestine, right? And then Israel and, Jews migrating from 1880, particularly to 1920, but then further on, how they, move into Palestine and how they're seen as a European colonizer, right? But there are two moments and two perceptions. It's not what I think personally, but it's what you sort of see historically in these records of perceptions of one another. And I think that is a methodological sort of nuance and way that we can talk to Jews, Blacks, Muslims, Zionists, Palestinians about these moments of perception, and maybe could kind of acknowledge that in the way that you were talking about before. with the victim and the perpetrator in those moments. And I think that has had some really helpful, like, I think conversations that I've been in with Jews and Muslims and, people who will not talk to each other that are Israelis or Palestinians. And I think, it's a useful way of thinking. And, Michael Rothbard talks about this as multidimensional memory, right? Different times and different moments. But I'm talking about this historical period, right? That is happening right there in that moment, and what happens with that perception. And this Langston Hughes quote sort of brings it together for me in a way that is just very profound, but also sort of a plea, right? You were victimized. You understand what this feels like. Will you not help me? Right? Will you not help me? And do not be like those folks, right? Don't treat me like the colored folks, because you know what Hitler was about. And Jim Crow was not called a fascist, right? So this is sort of, I think that's really fascinating for us to think about today, even in America, how we're looking at these different moments and different kind of, what we call intersectionality, but these interracial issues that we're having.
I think it's really interesting to not only mark what you've talked about, which is, both and, but thinking about us versus them, and our positions are constantly changing, and how our perceptions, things that we sort of inherit from our families, the historical memory and the media that's around us, but also the narratives and the different views that we have. We're talking about a upcoming trip someplace, and who's sponsoring the trip, and what kind of conversations are we going to be having around that. And I wanted to switch to a question that came in from one of the viewers about the notion of intersections. And the question is, both speakers, you're speaking about intersections, a word that evokes a kind of spatial stability. But Dr. Afridi, you've pointed out privilege changes. How would either of you elaborate on the notion of a dynamic rather than a static notion of intersection? And how do you see such an elaboration shifting the discourse of intersectionality? It's a big question.
Want me to take? All right. I think it's all dynamic. I think intersectionality is by its nature dynamic. And that is that all of us hold multiple identities, if we're going to use that as a category, marker. And as a consequence of that, code switching, is a word like, one needs to sort of change or alter one aspect of their identity if they're going into a professional world, or if you're a woman into a man's world, and the rest of it. So I think that what the dynamic nature of intersectionality does is makes its study nearly impossible, in that there's just no end. It's just an infinite amount. And really, for me, the vocabulary is just a way to express that we are all dynamic, we are all operating in complicated ways, we all do things that can appear to be self-contradictory, but it all makes sense because nobody is just one thing, and we're all navigating and weighing as we go. And I think even through our lives, we can sort of make certain parts of our identity more central or less central as our own, growth and development goes too. So I think it's an excellent question, and I agree with it. And I have no definite answer, because I think that's the point of that complexity.
I think Mark, I think you did a really good job, and I think that I think I mentioned this before, is that I have, sort of reservations with the idea of intersectionality, because it's not always dynamic, right? It can become static, and it becomes a pot where you just throw in everybody who has some kind of racial, gender issue. That to me is uncomfortable. Or, for example, as we've seen in the United States, there are certain people who are allowed to be in certain demonstrations and marches, and others are not. That becomes an exceptionalism, I think, that is really problematic. Or what I try to term how problematic it is for me when liberal white Americans talk about the suffering of others, by going on a demonstration. I'm not saying it's wrong. Okay, don't get me wrong. It's not bad to demonstrate and to do that, but they turn around and go to their world. So there's also this problem we're having, and it happened during Black Lives Matter, and it's happening now, is that there's a semblance of, we are, part of this movement against institutions. But is that movement really about white institutions, right? I mean, this becomes lost, I think, in these progressive movements, these liberal movements. And then we sort of have to sit back and say, okay, well, that's weird. I mean, my daughter told me the other day that her friend who's African-American, a white girl came up to her and patted her on the shoulder and said, "I'm so sorry about your suffering," and walked away. Yeah, I mean, so there's this weirdness, right? I mean, I'm not saying it's bad, because we're going to get to some place at some point, but I'm also talking about, let's be cautious. Let's be really cautious about how we think about these issues and how we think about each other in this moment of either suffering, victimhood, or is this a time that everybody has an issue with something institutional? And is that something that we all have something against institutional, really something common? Or how do we think of, and that's why I think we're in trouble when we just put everything in a pot and say, yes, let's all go out and march with Black Lives Matter, right? But then let's not include Zionists, or let's not include Zionists in the Women's March. I mean, that's, to me, it's problematic. Because it kind of says, okay, well, we're still excluding. We're still excluding, regardless of what you believe. We're still excluding. And that, to me, becomes that whole idea of static, right? Yes, allow the Zionists to come in, because maybe you'll have a conversation with what that means. Right. And that's sort of where I am in terms of these different movements, the who is excluded and who is included. And that's what race is, right? We try to racialize the other, the one that we fear, the one that's not, belonging. And these are concepts that we all are sort of raised with throughout our lives. That's how I would think about it.
It's interesting because the themes that I'm hearing for both of you, there's sort of four different ways that, as scholars, you're interacting with this discourse. There's the political discourse around us. There's the intellectual conversation like the one we're having now. There's the scholarship that you generate, but there's also sort of your own personal identities. And I want to go to another question that's come in from a colleague who's asking, so identities, histories, and narratives, I imagine we can all agree, is about power. How do we pluralize, as you mentioned, through concepts of intersectionality, vulnerability, humanity, without reproducing the same power contests over who suffers more, who gets to speak, who owns the narrative, and thus deserves more redistribution of power through reparation, accountability, or acknowledgement?
Well, yeah, that's a navigation, isn't it? And, we referenced the oppression Olympics before, which is like not good if everyone's going to try to figure out who's been victimized more and worse. And then every group that's marginalized that gets power immediately turns around and marginalizes another group. And then we end up where we're at. So in the one sense, yeah, that there's clarity in that argument. It gets complicated and more challenging, though, when we take that analysis and put it up against historical inequities and systemic issues. And from Anaz's earlier comment, I was actually thinking about, and we were talking about sort of white Jewish liberals and the well-intentioned things they were doing that turned out to be awful, right? And I got to believe that they were not doing that to be awful, and it really was awful. So so what happens, right? This is a failure of consciousness. It's centering itself, and I'll just speak from my own now educational experience in mostly synagogues and also in JCCs around the racism directed at Jews of color, who come into synagogue spaces to pray and are instantly, forced and subjected to all sorts of racist comments, which in most cases, the white Jews making them think they're being nice and welcoming. In fact, it's not welcoming to walk up to a Black person and say, "Why are you here?" And where they have to prove, or to assume that the Latinx person is on the custodial crew when you hand them your garbage and tell them to go throw it away. And these are stories that now I've learned, and been reflected on. So when I'm engaging with my fellow white Jews on this question, I'm getting in the middle of the pain and challenge of understanding that well-intentioned liberalism actually goes wrong a lot, that there are, to center, in this case, Jews of color, which is what we're trying to do, is to say, your experience, your trauma, your story is right and valid instantly. You do not need to convince me, and nor do I need to be convinced as a standard, to say that you're right. And I was just learning from someone on a podcast last week, which was like, if somebody, it was actually Rabbi Angela Buchdahl at Central Synagogue in New York, and it's like, if somebody walks up to you and asks a nice, innocent question, kind of like why you're Jewish once or twice, it's an interesting curiosity. But if you go through your whole life and that's all you ever get when you walk into a synagogue, it's actually deeper and more systemic, and is revealing just an utter lack of connection. So I would say that one of the underlying premises of this Oppression Olympics question is the fact that to get to that point, we haven't yet listened, and we haven't empathized, and we haven't been open to understanding that our own experience of America, or Judaism in this case, is actually fundamentally different than others, and to embrace that fundamental difference without feeling threatened that it's undermining one's whole sense of oneself, right? And as soon as this is like so hard to do, and as we can begin to do it, for me at least, I'll just say, as I continue to learn myself, I have fewer and fewer concerns about sharing power with those who are not white men, because I'm actually seeing that it's a whole lot better to be there. I'll share one quick story. When I was giving the Black Power Jewish Politics talk at a university in LA, they brought out the chair of Black Studies to sort of chat with me, and a Black man, and he's like, everyone says that white Jews should give up their power and privilege to people like me. So he said, I'll tell you something, when I get power and privilege, last thing I'm doing is giving it up. Who should give up power and privileges? But how about this? Bring me in, bring others in, share, open things up. And in this sense, we don't get into the Oppression Olympics, and we're not into fearing that one side or the other is going to go after the other. And it's just a new understanding and framing, which I hope is more cooperative.
I also want to say, and I know this is like not directly to the question, but it might be, David. Fry is there. He's a friend of both of ours. But, I also have a lot of thoughts about how to teach this stuff, right? To my white Catholic male students, especially, and how to make them understand, not to like just, okay, I'm just going to doze off now in my mind, right? She's going to talk about this and it's all over the place and I'm going to get alienated. And, and I think that is a tool, right? We need tools of engagement with white males, actually, because I think if you're not going to have tools of engagement, it all falls apart, right? You don't get to be brought in, Mark, or shared, right? You stop sharing. And I think that is one of the problems that you're talking about, this liberalism that goes on, is that we put up these walls where we're not letting people in. Or, questions that people ask me, are white people bad? And I'm like, what? Right? I mean, so it's like this again, this falling back into this black and white and the static notion of all white males, all Black people, and I think we have to be careful when we're dismantling institutional power, and be very careful in how we use our tools, and how generous we are with everybody, including white people. And I think that I would insist on as a human being, but also insist on as somebody who's Muslim in terms of human rights and ethics. But I also think that, there is that generosity that we have to allow for things to actually dismantle, because nobody dismantles with a sledgehammer. And it doesn't bode well for our society. I've seen it in our society, in the Muslim world. I've seen it in terms of power and women and men dynamics. I've seen it Jews and Muslims, or blacks and whites. So I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind as an educator, as somebody who is doing these Zooms, Mark, you and I, and to be actually generous in terms of how we think, because I think there are a lot of people in America that have approached me. A lot of Jews have come to me and said, I never really understood my white privilege. Can you help me understand it, Menaz? And I really love that. I mean, I'm like, wow, but I love that, because there is sort of like, let me understand, I don't get it. And I think that's the first way of acknowledging how power dynamics work.
So we have another person who's asking a question more and saying, this is not happening in my synagogue, and we need a new belief system everyone could ascribe to. And I'm really curious, because we're talking about really personal issues that are affecting our society, and the temperature is one of accusation, harassment. And I'm curious, you're both at the center of some pretty intense conversations. How are you doing through all this as a person, not as a scholar?
Well, thank you for the question. Most of the time, fine. Some of the time, not. Now I'll just step out of the scholarly and say that, we've been on for 55 minutes. And when we end this, I'm going to go take a walk, because I'm going to need it. I want to go back with all the learning that I had, but I just need to process out. I need to be away from a screen. Intellectualizing and teaching is easy, because for me, it removes the emotion. And I think, as Menaz has been reminding us too, it's all there. And regardless, and a lot of this also is gendered and race-based too, in terms of how I communicate. So I want to give myself the space to feel it, and to process it, and get ready for the next one. So thank you for asking the question.
So I just want to say I'm exhausted. That's the first thing. Because I think that, there is a lot of demand for us to be talking about these issues. Personally, I feel that it's exhausting, but I also personally feel sometimes very frustrated with myself. And, I know there's some questions about, how do we educate people? How do we teach people? And, I think for me as a human being, I want to say, okay, let's all do this all the time. And let's, get to a place together. And, I'm always about hospitality and people coming to my house and building community and eating and food and all kinds of people from the world. But it's just not there, right? I mean, it's like this fantasy I have maybe of, Abraham's tent, as, the Jews would put it. But we also would talk about, this kind of hospitality, this understanding. So I think personally, I feel sometimes lonely that people won't just come into my tent and hang out, that I'm always working, that sometimes I think the personal reactions or interactions are the ways that we transform. I always tell my kids that if you don't have emotional bonds with people who are different from you, then you will never grow. That, we need to have desegregate ourselves in terms of our faith, in terms of our race, our ethnicity. We have to stop living in certain areas because that's what we're comfortable with. And that's what we've done. And that's why our kids are growing up to be, again, caught up with this identity and reification of being Jewish, being Muslim, but, not really talking about what it means to be American in a way that we're trying to dismantle, right? So I think that personally, I think that is what I miss, is the personal and the kind of comfort with a community of people that kind of gives me something to think about on a very emotional and personal level. That's how I would respond.
It's something we could talk about for a very long time. The toll of doing this work and living in many different spaces and how it resonates in our body. I think there's a book that's very popular right now, The Body Keeps Score. I wanted to just ask one, closing question to you both. Given how toxic our political landscape is right now, do you think teaching about tolerance and empathy can help, or are we beyond that?
I gotta believe it's going to help. Just like from my heart, I do. And this is presumptuous, and of course I don't know it's true, but in my optimism, I am viewing the horrendous political climate of today as a trailing indicator that we're actually talking about what we need to be talking about. Systems of oppression operate under the status quo when nobody is engaging or caring enough to do it. And the moment that you're really making progress is the moment the backlash is coming. Because for folks who are threatened by this, it is really, really threatening. I'm scared, I'll be honest, right? I'm scared for democracy. I'm scared for this country. Today, yesterday, 6 months from now. And I know, as I'll speak now as an historian, we have not had this moment in 100 years since Reconstruction, even more than the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s, to actually address systemic racisms. And for that, I am feeling gifted and blessed to get to be in this place at this time, and I am hopeful. So I am very scared, and I am hoping that the fear is a sign of progress, but I don't know.
Yeah, I think messy times are good. That's kind of how I see history, right? When there's a mess, hopefully it'll be positive. But I want to talk about empathy for a second. I mean, you can't really teach empathy. You really can't. But what you can do is walk empathy. And a lot of the times in my classes, I do projects in the community, or we take different ways of looking at material, even like the Holocaust, or Islam, or even Hinduism or Buddhism, whatever I'm teaching, right? Or gender, and like maybe having them work on a project with Guatemalan families that are in need, and not even tell them if they're legal or not legal, whatever. I mean, there's a certain kind of sense of the practical that's really important in terms of the theoretical and the historical. And I think that forging that, and it's not always easy, it's more work, to be honest with you, but the transformations from projects of students, from different encounters or different ways of being in the world, are just amazing. And it keeps my hope up. It keeps my optimism up. And the other thing is, when you're doing this kind of work, you meet the most amazing people in the world. And there is no way that you're going to give up what you do. The people I have met through the work I do, I cannot tell you that it literally is the reason I get up and go to work and do what I do, because they're out there. There are people creating empathy. There are people fighting for one another. There are people who are making peace building in Israel and Palestine. There are, Blacks and Jews that are working together. So, I mean, that is something I want us to keep in mind, because that's really, really important. It may not be the whole majority, but that minority, the grassroots level, is so important to us. I mean, I know this because I'm from Pakistan originally. My country is run by nonprofit women that are running the show. we would never be a country without them. And these are women who are running amazing nonprofit organizations, feeding people, clothing people, educating people, fighting for human rights, going to legal courts. I really believe that as a Muslim, and I'm talking as a Pakistani now, not just an American, that this is actually possible. But you have to have the right belief, the kind of generosity with others. We forget about generosity, and you have to be able to be vulnerable.
I'm just in awe. I got into this work because I believe in the power of connecting person by person. I don't believe in my life that I'll change lots of minds, but being able to sit with another human being and have these conversations is what gets me up each day also. And I want to say thank you to you both for your generosity this evening. And I want to thank you for also showing me the way and having conversations and modeling what this looks like intellectually, spiritually, and also just as individual human beings. There's tremendous love and there's tremendous heart that you bring to it. And it's just so inspiring. And I'm really honored that you've taken time tonight to be here with us. And I want to, on that note, close the program. I want to thank Dr. Manaz Afridi. I want to thank Dr. Mark Dollinger. Thank you to all of our participants. And we hope that you stay safe and well. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Laura. What a great opportunity. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you. Thank you both. Honored to be.
Honored to be here too.
Stay safe.
Good night.